So up next, we have Professor Bindi Bennett, a Professorial Research Fellow at Federation University, and Dr. Clare Archer-Lean, Senior Lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Bindi and Clare will present on an Aboriginal perspective on animal management in remote and regional Aboriginal communities, with a particular focus on camp dogs. So over to Bindi and Clare.
Wayama, Nea, Winengay Lana, Dawanaya, Winengay Lana, Marinaya, Winengay Lana, Murinaya, Gamilaroi, Nay, Winengay Lana.
We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we work, live and play on. We recognise the continuing connections to waters, land and culture, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I myself acknowledge the gift of wisdom that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples generously share with us, and I also pay respects to my Gamilaroi ancestors that came before me.
Yamanindayu, Bindinaya, Gamilaroi Naya, Gaya Naya, Nale, Duandu.
My name is Bindi. I'm a professor at the National Centre of Reconciliation, Truth and Justice. I'm a social worker by trade and a parent, and I'm very interested in re-indigenising Western spaces.
Nara, my name's Clare. I'm a white settler scholar and senior lecturer in English at the University of the Sunshine Coast, working, learning and living on Gubbi country, and I was raised on Anawan country. I'm committed to rethinking the stories we tell about the more than human world through transdisciplinary and anti-colonial research, and I acknowledge also all Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in the room today. The research that Bindi and I are going to be talking about today really emerged as a dialogue between Bindi's research on human-animal bonds and Aboriginal well-being, and my compassionate conservation view of dangerous animal management. I've done some work on dingoes on Gowrie, but also my work in storytelling and animal storytelling and narrative from an anti-colonial viewpoint. The first stage of our research was a systematic review of literature on the relationships between humans and dogs in rural Aboriginal communities here and internationally. Most of the literature looked at public health and veterinary science. We also looked at grey literature and organisational information from a few animal management programs. Now, after necessary exclusions for relevance, we only located 41 items. Now, that was a while ago, and there is obviously more now potentially published, but the small number and the focus on pathology in the literature led us to a second stage of research. Now we're at the beginning of conducting narrative interviews with animal management workers and vets with experience in remote and regional Aboriginal communities to ascertain the challenges and potential models in terms of the care and management of camp dogs. Methodologically, both phases of our work, it's driven by a decolonising, or more accurately, anti-colonial approach, which means centralising speaking positions and the attendant perspectives of everybody involved. Aboriginal people have long and continuing histories of being excluded from the management of wildlife areas, paralleled by the historical and contemporary pathologising and interventionist policies in domestic lives. A decolonising approach, in Linda to Hawaii Smith's terms, recognises the complex ways in which research itself is part of the colonial and governmental power, a power that is often sourced in the academy So the camp dog may be framed in an academic epistemology which attempts to define and make sense of the known. Decolonising methodology, on the other hand, focuses on social justice for Indigenous peoples founded in self-determination, and I'm citing Tuck and Yang there. Our approach means acknowledging the epistemological bias that may be in place in the research reviewed, including my own, and searches for sites of self-determined and culturally specific approaches to management.
So Aboriginal kinship systems are foundational systems that define our relationships, roles and responsibilities within our Aboriginal communities in Australia. Kinship extends beyond just being the immediate family, and it encompasses a wide network of relationships that include extended family members, animals and land features. This system deeply shapes Indigenous perspectives on welfare ethics, emphasising collective care, respect and interconnectedness. One unique example of kinship ethics in practice is seen in relationship with camp dogs. These dogs are important and have an important role in the social fabric. They provide companionship, protection, and even serve as informal watchdogs. Unlike Western perspectives, where pet ownership is often individual, camp dogs are communally cared for and are not typically restricted or confined. In this context, welfare ethics involves a shared responsibility where community members collectively ensure the dog's basic needs, including food, health and shelter, are met. This communal approach reflects the broader Indigenous ethic of collective responsibility, which underscores that welfare, whether for people or animals, is about our interconnected well-being for all of our community members. By respecting and supporting camp dogs as part of the kinship network, Indigenous communities demonstrate an ethical system where care is inherently shared, highlighting how kinship values shape a unique approach to welfare that goes beyond individualism and goes beyond hierarchical systems. This relationship encourages both human and animal welfare as essential to the community's social and cultural health.
So what are some of the current issues that we've seen through our research into the literature, but also into talking with people working in the space? Essentially, what we found in these two stages is that different discursive regimes are continually at work. Unacknowledged bias can direct knowledge and thus outcomes on the ground, no matter how well-intentioned programs of care or research might be. Animal welfare approaches prioritise the health of the animal, but vet services have a range of problems. They might come often with little or any cultural training and might be then based on assumed norms which are incongruous to an Aboriginal community. These services can be inaccessible or fly in and fly out, which means there's very little community trust that's built up or continuity of practitioners and relationships. They can be inaffordable, which is a massive issue, and they can focus on attempts to conduct adult education into camp dog welfare. That is to cultivate responsibility among human caretakers, and that responsibility is determined along Western lines. This can reinforce rhetorics of blame and cultural deficits through patronisation. Animal management legislation too is very vexed. Despite vets' animal welfare focus, camp dogs themselves are actually managed under some of the same policies which control pest species such as vermin, rats and insect problems and so on. Further, westernised pieces of legislation, such as the new Queensland legislation to regulate dog movements and behaviour, are ineffective when animal management workers are expected to enforce against the community they belong to and live in, especially in the context of harmful histories of policing. Similarly, microchipping legislation suggests ownership is immutable and individual, and this may not be the case. Further, if bylaws do exist, and in many places they do not, the local governments responsible may not enact that bylaw due to the scale of geographical or infrastructural challenges. Discursively, the language of camp dog welfare is often to change the dog's behaviour, including strategies that restrict their movement. Yet the source issue may not be cheeky dogs themselves, but a lack in infrastructure, for example, flawed or broken down detritus removal services. Dog to human ratios denser in Aboriginal communities mean dogs may be seen by the community as having freedom to move as they wish. Camp dogs may promote a sense of interconnectedness in the whole community by paying visits to different people while roaming, yet in urban areas, a free roaming dog is considered feral and problematic. Strategies of containment, shelters, empowerment, fencing, leads, registration and euthanasia may not be practicable or culturally appropriate in some instances. And in many communities, they just don't exist. Pounds are not there and so on. And the complexity of who regulates and legislates animal containment is further compounded by the need to follow, as I said, proper community relations and the colonial associations of the police and other services. On top of all of this, poor dog health just can affect human health due to psychological reasons, but also zoonotic disease transmission. Here, research can play a negative rather than a positive role. For example, some research into the non-zoonotic transmission of the mite responsible for scabies resulted in a reduction of subsidised leatherback treatment for camp dogs. But humans can still get scabies from an infected dog, even if that mite does not breed on human skin. Further, human families experience grief when parvo and other diseases impact dog kin. Ongoing colonisation can directly impact psychological well-being and may occasionally create situations where dogs might be mistreated or neglected. Despite the rarity of such instances, the colonial vectors involved, Indigenous communities are often identified as the source of the problem. Media representations and some settler visitors to communities present such issues as a symptom of community dysfunction when it is not. None of this is to reduce the import of healthy, happy, non-aggressive dogs. Rather, to stress that the factors are interrelated and iterative, and thus human and canine health should be seen as reciprocal rather than hierarchical.
So for a truly impactful approach that's going to be sustainable and make real change, we think that funding for Aboriginal programs must be ongoing rather than temporary, fly-in, fly-out, or even project-based. Re-Indigenising these programs requires co-collaboration with those Aboriginal communities, ensuring that policies and programs are created with rather than for the people they're meant to serve. This approach aligns with community development principles that prioritise empowerment and self-determination. We need to start moving away from attitudes of blame or a sense of right or wrong that's very rigid, and instead start to shift from a moralising stance to one of genuine support and, I guess, curiosity, being able to ask the community, what do you actually want and what do you actually need? It's essential to recognise that Aboriginal people are not the problem. Rather, the issues lie in colonisation and the dominance of purely Western approaches, which often overlook Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and strengths. To work effectively in this space, it's crucial to be aware of your own worldviews, cultures, race, and biases. Above all, this work calls for you to be a good human, guided by ethics of self-determination, respecting choice, and empowering communities to create their own solutions.
Some of the science findings so far, and we must stress this is a work in progress, and we would really like to talk to you in the question time about the work and your thoughts. As part of creating solutions to perceived welfare issues for both humans and dogs, Aboriginal community perspectives are rarely sought or integrated into dog management policy and practice at many levels. There are excellent and isolated examples where community consultation and employment of Aboriginal people redirects the strategic planning and approach to assisting communities. And we're shouting out here to AMREC here, which, you know, some of you may be aware of this organisation. Yet these organisations are continually at risk of funding cuts, and there is still a dearth of peer-reviewed literature about the human, individual and community impacts of dog health that draws on Indigenous knowledges, perspectives and engagement. In addition, a Western public health focus can centralise intervention strategies and controlling the negative impacts of individual free-roaming dogs while failing to support environments, services and infrastructure that foster the beneficial effects of the relationships between dogs and people. To shift this, community-determined management and intra-species kinship connectivity must be centralised. Animal management should be driven by meaningful collaborations that are inclusive of Aboriginal worldviews and ways of knowing, being and doing. There is room to increase a self-consciously anti-colonial approach, opposing and resisting colonialism in all forms of thinking, structures, policy and practice, and thus addressing racialised deficit assumptions. It is vital to acknowledge the culturally specific needs of each community, including responsibility as a collective, rather than the idea of I ownership. To activate these principles, our work thus far suggests that the development of a culturally responsive framework for tertiary veterinarian education and for the induction of animal management workers new to communities would be very beneficial.
So as Claire said, we're still in the midst of the research because we love this work, quite frankly. In the current stage, we would like to find out how we can make models better for and with communities and animals. We're interested in drawing a fuller picture of the different existing animal care models in rural and remote Aboriginal communities, and we aim to ask what people and organisations are doing well, what they need and want to enhance their practice, how we can make working with animals better for and with communities and animals. We aim to carry out broad consultation with relevant not-for-profits, state and federal organisations working with animals in a wide range of contexts, centralising the voice of those who are attempting culturally responsive frameworks and models. So if you have any experience in this area, we would love to speak with you. Our emails are on this slide for you to contact us at any stage. And thank you for listening to us talk.
Professor Bindi Bennett and Dr. Clare Archer-Lean now join us live. Welcome to you both and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Happy there, Bindi. Clare, we think you're online. Can you unmute perhaps? Possibly some more of our technical glitches, I apologise. But Bindi, if it's okay, I might continue. For anyone who is interested in animal management in remote Aboriginal communities and interested in participating in Bindi and Clare's research, as they mentioned at the end of their presentation, please get in touch via their email addresses and we'll have those posted in the chat by someone from our team. And now we'll get kick-started with some of our questions. So can we perhaps look into how, sorry, let me just scroll to the right questions. That would be a good start. What education systems are in place in these communities to ensure animal health and welfare are maintained for both camp dogs and other species such as livestock? So I do know that you perhaps don't have a huge focus on the livestock side of things. So what about education systems? Can you perhaps just talk about what is in place there and what you have found about how well they work in the camp dog situation?
Can I just ask whose education? So unfortunately in Australia, we're incredibly colonised and we have this idea that colonised ideas are the best ideas and are supreme to other ideas. So there is an 80,000-year-old education system in Aboriginal communities and they are very well in place, and that is the kinship system that we speak to. So there is, of course, the Western idea of animal welfare, and Claire and I push back very much against that idea. So that's not working. They don't align in terms of values and ethics and ways of doing. So that is why it's not working currently. So that is why non-Indigenous people will often go into those communities and make a lot of judgments and think that things aren't working well because they're not aware of what has been in place for a very long time. Claire, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess it's an issue where a lot of the animal welfare positions and the human welfare positions are both very much focused on an animal as an individual and as the human individual's culpability and responsibility, which really draws in very colonial discourses around deficit and pathology and all of these things. So this is, as we said, this is not sort of downplay the real issues facing communities, but it does rather miss the existing knowledges that are there and also the very complex interrelated problems that are existing there and opportunities that are there. So quite often there might be a particular focus on, say, individually treating vaccination or worming or an individual's responsibility to chain up their dog or contain their dog in some way, when actually there's a whole lot of other issues to do with government not providing infrastructure to fix the local rubbish removal systems and infrastructure there, and not acknowledging the different ways in which free roaming dogs are actually, in some communities, not all, in some communities, understood to have their own individual rights and may live between houses and so on. And yeah, so yeah, it's not a working on the ground to understand all of those things. And it also comes down to a whole lot of categories which seem to be really crucial to colonial understandings of welfare, where animals are put in a position of whether they're seen to be belonging or not belonging, feral or domesticated, whether they're, you know, and all of these terms are something that are constantly being kind of disputed in terms of a community understanding of what welfare and belonging and community might mean.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think it's a really interesting, different perspective, different way to look at this these issues. Very much so. There's a good question here from Christina about whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives align with the One Welfare Framework, and what are the obvious gaps between them?
The most obvious gap between them is that One Health comes from a very scientific and Western scientific policy-driven framework, which is very different to an Aboriginal way of thinking of interconnectedness with the land, water, people, spirit, and community. So for us, health is just not the absence of disease, but it's also got that cultural, emotional, social, emotional well-being. So at this time, that Western scientific view doesn't really look at our spiritual dream time connection, cultural connection, collective connection. That's the biomedical model just does not really fit into our model. So that is really one of the biggest differences. And the second biggest difference in Australia is that we don't really understand sovereignty and we don't really understand governance here at the moment. And so when we're looking at data, we're not looking at data sovereignty yet. We're not really looking at real governance yet, and how elders can actually be seen as authorities in the area. So that would be my quick response to that.
Great. Thank you. Next question I have here. Does this mean that Australia would possibly always need two different models for free roaming dog management? One would be the anti-colonial model for Aboriginal communities, which would not apply to urban regions, while the other would be the more common colonial approach that we currently have in our cities and small towns.
Yeah, I'm not into anything colonial, so I'd really just like everything to have an anti-colonial model. I think that urban Aboriginal people, we still have our dream time and ancestral knowledge. So just because we live I don't even live in town, but even if I did, it wouldn't mean that I would see my sentient partners as something different anymore, want to have a colonial approach to them. I never actually want to take a colonial approach. So I think one could suit us all. That's what I think. What do you think, Claire?
I mean, I think we're living in very vexing times, and it's very important that we're having this conference on ethics, because we're seeing a global situation in which ethics is becoming a kind of fiction, you know, constructed in the minute as people move through it. And so, yeah, I completely agree. I think that really what Australia needs to do is understand that it has so much to learn from Indigenous knowledges and systems, and that the knowledges and systems that have dominated have actually made a mess of a lot of the environment. We're looking at some of the other speakers and the issue of, you know, species extinction up to 40% by the by 2050. Like, these systems are not actually working for animals. So, I mean, of course, there are knowledges that need to be kept in place. There'll be a great many vets in the room, and, you know, vet knowledge is absolutely crucial. Vets are, in many communities, really important. We've talked to a lot of animal management workers who have worked and vets who have worked in remote and regional Aboriginal communities, and that knowledge is, you know, important and has its really important place there. But I think that there is room to just shake things up completely, and really focus on an anti-colonial approach. What that might mean is going to need a lot more conversations, and that's the sort of stuff that Bindi and I are looking at next. But we are really looking at very specific people and communities. I think the whole point that there would be just one specific thing that suits everybody, that is the problem, and that is the colonial mindset, because it's this idea that, you know, everyone's going to have 1 to 2 registered dogs, and they're all going to be fenced entirely, and they're all going to be desexed at this particular point, and they're all, you know, going to be treated in this particular way. There needs to be a much broader conversation about the actual realities of the ways in which different animals live in different communities, and a recognition of the validity of that.
Yeah, sounds like quite a gnarly future research program you've got on your hands. So I'd be really interested to keep seeing how that unfolds, and hopefully you can make some real tangible change. There's a question here from Lizzie that says, did Indigenous communities include this style of human-animal relationship with dingoes prior to colonisation?
Yes. However, we have to remember that dogs were not native. So there was at some point the dingoes came to Australia in some way. So there's that thin line, but absolutely yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And a question from Michelle, putting aside the issue of owned versus free roaming, what do we know about the welfare outcomes for camp dogs as assessed more so, and I take the point earlier around interpreting animal welfare differently, but by our contemporary understanding of animal welfare, how do you think that might differ to an Indigenous assessment of animal welfare, assuming that Indigenous people have that same concept, but perhaps we don't know that for sure? So I think that's an interesting question to further unpack your point earlier, Bindi.
Yeah, I'll probably throw this one to Claire first, if that's okay.
Right.
Well, I mean, I'd like to identify again my speaking position as a non-Indigenous person. My first point is that I don't think we can talk about Indigenous people all having the same concept of anything. This is a country that has in excess of 250 different independent nations within it, and also people living in different geographical contexts. So I don't speak for anybody in terms of what that concept of animal welfare might be in a totally unified and singular sense. But in terms of welfare outcomes, I think welfare outcomes, this is where we often see a kind of friction between people who come newly into animal management work, perhaps having worked in a metropolitan area with a dominant non-Indigenous community, and then come out to a remote or a regional Aboriginal community, that assumption of what animal welfare will be is that it will be an individual process. That is absolutely not necessarily unifying with people there, but also more importantly, not economically possible, because of the vets maybe in some communities might only come a couple of times a year. They might be provided privately, or they might be provided by amazing not-for-profit organisations like AMREC. There might be a vet who travels through various communities but is at some local sort of area that's overseeing an entire region. It's just so varying. People might not have the money to get to that place where a vet might set up in town and offer particular services. So you hear some vets who have been there for a while talk about different terms, such as trying to adhere in terms of welfare to a more herd health idea for a camp dog community with who are kind of operating more communally. So that's more from those vets and animal management workers working in that space, because the distances and the economic conditions mean that just popping down to your local vet for regular treatments is not going to be possible. Bindi, did you want to talk about some other dimensions?
No, I think that's the conversation, isn't it? That there's so much privilege in urban, particularly, and for non-Indigenous people with animals, and wealth, and a whole lot of other things that really influence how people see welfare and how we see welfare, wellness, relationality, kinship is probably a very different conversation. And then there has to be the conversation of capacity, and the capacity to do treatments and to be able to access services is very different for someone living on Groote Island than it is for someone living in the suburbs of Brisbane. So I think you have to take each community and have discussions about how it's all going. We all want our animals to be well. We all want our sentient beings to be well. We all have that, I would say, accountability, but also desire. So I think it's about how we get the two systems to work together better. That's what Claire and I are llooking at.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, Bindi, some of the work we've done, and also like people like Ma et al. Have shown that, say, like Ma et al. Have looked at some regional New South Wales communities and just talked about why some of these projects might fail, because welfare and well-being also very much means the freedom of the animal, and also the deep love and connection that comes from that, an acknowledgement of that freedom, freedom to move potentially in the house, freedom to move beyond the house, all of those, freedom to have a litter. There's a lot more elements that come from regulation and control of movement that then intersect with centuries of colonial harm. So it becomes a complicated issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing with us some of the significant differences and also the practical challenges that exist. Really do look forward to seeing how your research and your work unfolds in the future. And I do believe you're joining us for our forum later. So I apologise yet again for not being able to get to all the amazing questions from our audience, but we'll have another go later this afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us, Bindi and Claire.
Thanks
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Okay, so we are now just leading into our short break, but before we do so, I would like to share a really exciting development from RSPCA Australia and to let you know about a new animal welfare course that we are launching during this seminar. The course is called Animal Welfare, an Introduction, and it's a free online short course that will help you understand the key fundamental concepts when it comes to animal welfare. The interactive course takes you through an introduction to animal welfare using practical examples of positive and negative experiences to highlight animals' experience in the world and how these experiences can affect their welfare. There are a few key messages that the course gets across, including what animal welfare is, and interestingly, from our previous talk, probably from a very colonial perspective and modern person's perspective, the link between sentience and animal welfare, the 5 domains model of animal welfare assessment, and how individuals can promote and provide opportunities for animals to experience a good life. The course has been developed in collaboration with a number of international animal welfare organisations, and it only takes about 20 minutes to complete. So we encourage anyone who works with or for animals or who really wants to better understand animal welfare, even for their own cat and dog at home, and how we can promote animal welfare, we encourage you to sign up. As I mentioned, it's a free educational course, and just popped up on your screen as everyone's asking for the link is a QR code and a little button for you to access it now. Please don't get distracted and don't forget to come back to the seminar after our short break. There's 2 ways you can complete the course. You can be a guest and sort of fly through the course very quickly, or you can actually log in and sign up, which will actually give you the access to a quiz at the end, and then you get a short certificate of completion. So we really encourage you to sign up and put your details in there. I want to give a significant nod to our science team, and in particular, Dr. Sarah Zito, who worked very hard on the development of this course and to ensure it reflected the most up-to-date perspectives of animal welfare science and turned it into something very easy to follow with practical examples on how you can apply it to your cats at home, your dog, and even farm animals and animals more generally. We are really hoping to be able to expand on this course in the future and develop more materials, but it really is a great snapshot about animal welfare. So we encourage you to follow that QR code. Okay, so now we're going to take a short break and we're going to join back at 2:30 Canberra time. So that's in 15 minutes. And ensure that you don't, as I said, get distracted by doing the course. And make sure that you please come back because we've got a really interesting afternoon session. So we look forward to seeing you in about 15 minutes time. Thank you.